Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Gentleman Psychic. I am your host, your MC, your master of ceremonies. Richard-Lael is one name. If I were just Richard, I'd be a dick. Anyway, hello, my beautiful friends, my dearest fiends. Tonight we have a special selection of stories for you. I cannot wait until we begin. I always like to start a little bit early because I like for you, those of you lovely people at home, I like for you to hear the clock because I feel like it's become a good part of it, a big part of it. I hope everyone has had a good week. I Bonjour, hello, hello, mi amor. Thank you very much, Lauren. Very lovely to see you here. I am struggling a little bit today with, I have a little bit of acid reflux. I should not have eaten what I ate, and yet I ate it anyway. So I may not be able to complete the full hour, but I will. Amy Edwards, hello, I see you. Welcome. Let's see. We just have about 45 seconds before the clock, and then we can actually begin story time. I don't want to be interrupted by the clock, at least not at the beginning. So, how is your week? How have you been? Have you done anything exciting? There's the clock. I don't know if I turned that off. 1 second. Let's see. Oh, I did. Mary Jane King, hello, good evening. Mike Pope, love my nails, thank you. Hello. Bo, hello, nice to see you. So, part of my magic that I've been doing for myself is that I've been varnishing my nails. Traditionally, I typically will do only black, but someone sent me this fabulous. I wish I had it here to show you. Someone sent me this lovely nail varnish, and I am truly honored. So I wear the green. I wear it on my ring finger. Amanda, hello, good evening. So I hope you had a good week. Tomorrow I am supposed to go to a Lutheran celebration of a 20s party. However, it is supposed to rain, and like Sunset Boulevard, they only want my car. John Maxwell, good evening, good evening. Melissa R., good evening. And for those of you who are watching in the future, good evening and welcome. I'm going to try to get through tonight, but I have a little bit of acid reflux, and I didn't even put on any makeup. So this is me sans makeup. Nail varnish, yes, no makeup. It's what happens with the acid reflux. Anyway, my beauties. Oh. Yes. So here's the other thing I need. So along with Lord Constantine Ladding, we are putting on an event in Atlanta on it's September, right? The 2nd of September. And we need makers. We need people who would be vendors, people who create art, people who create jewelry to sell at our event. And you could make a lot of money, and we'd love to have you. Anyway, if you would like to know more information, definitely send me a message on that for all of my friends in Atlanta. So we'd love to have you. Anyway, oh, also, if you'd like to go to this event in Atlanta, let me know. So without further ado, my guys and gals and non-gendered pals, let us continue with Speak of the Devil. I destroyed this poor book cover, but that does happen when one reads it. Lemon Juice, hello, Lauren Morgan. Richards, good evening, hello. We continue with The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. A few miles from Boston, in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or a morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side of the land rides abruptly from the water's edge into high ridge, on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. Under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, there was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly and at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill-gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged as a pirate. About the year 1727, just at the same time that the earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. The hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new-laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney. No traveler ever stopped at its door. A miserable horse, whose ribs were as articulate as the bars of gridiron, stalked about a field where a thin carpet of moss scarcely covered the ragged beds of pudding stone, tantalized and balked his hunger. And sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, look piteously at the passer-by, and seem to petition deliverance from this land of famine. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom's wife was a tall, termagant, fierce of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in wordy warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs of their conflicts were not confined to words. No one ventured, however, to interfere between them. The lonely wayfarer shrank within himself at the horrid clamor of the clappering, clawing, eyed the den of discord askance, and hurried on his way, rejoicing, if a bachelor, in his celibacy. One day that Tom Walker had been to a distant part of the neighborhood, he took what he considered a short-cut homeward through the swamp. Like most shortcuts, it was an ill-chosen route. The swamp was thickly grown with great gloomy pines and hemlocks, some of them 90 feet high, which made it dark at noonday, a retreat for all the owls of the neighborhood. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and mosses, where the green surface often betrayed the traveler into a gulf of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the abodes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, where the trunks of pines and hemlocks lay half drowned, half rotting, looking like alligators sleeping in the mire. Tom had long been picking his way cautiously through this treacherous forest, stepping from tuft to tuft of rushes and roots, which afforded precarious footholds among deep sloughs, or pacing carefully like a cat along the prostrate trunks of trees, startled now and then by the sudden screaming of bittern or the quacking of a wild duck rising on the wing from some solitary pool. At length he arrived at the firm piece of ground which ran out like a peninsula into the deep bosom of the swamp. It had been one of the strongholds of the Indians during their wars with the first colonists. Here they had thrown up all kind of fort, which they had looked upon as almost impregnable, and had used as a place of refuge for their squaws and children. Nothing remained of the old Indian fort but a few embankments, gradually sinking to the level of the surrounding earth, and already overgrown in part of oaks and other forest trees, the foliage of which formed a contrast to the dark pines and hemlocks of the swamp. It was late in the dusk of evening when Tom Walker reached the old fort, and he paused there a while to rest himself. Anyone but he would have felt unwilling to linger in this lonely, melancholy place, for the common people had a bad opinion of it, from the stories handed down from time of the Indian wars. Then it was asserted that the savages held incantations here and made sacrifices to the evil spirit. Tom Walker, however, was not a man to be troubled with any fears of this kind. He reposed himself for some time on the trunk of a fallen hemlock, listening to the boding cry of the tree-toad and delving with his walking staff into the mound of black mold at his feet. As he turned up the soil unconsciously, his staff struck against something hard. He raked it out of the vegetable mold, and lo, a cloven skull with an Indian tomahawk buried deep in it lay before him. The rust on the weapon showed the time that had elapsed since the death blow had been given. It was a dreary memento of fierce struggle that had taken place in the last foothold of the Indian warriors. "Hum," said Tom Walker as he gave it a kick to shake the dirt from it. "Let that skull alone," said a gruff voice. Tom lifted up his eyes and beheld a great black man seated directly opposite him on the stump of the tree. He was exceedingly surprised, having neither heard nor seen anyone approach, and he was still more perplexed on observing, as well as gathering gloom would permit, that the stranger was neither Negro nor Indian. It is true he was dressed in a rude half-Indian garb, and had red belt or sash swathed round his body, but his face was neither black nor copper color, but swarthy and dingy, and begrimed with soot, as if he had been accustomed to toil among fires and forges. He had shook of coarse black hair that stood out from his head in all directions, and bore an axe on his shoulder. He scowled for a moment at Tom with a pair of great red eyes. "What are you doing on my grounds?" said the black man with a hoarse, growling voice. "Your grounds," said Tom with a sneer. "No more your grounds than mine. They belong to Deacon Peabody." "Deacon Peabody be damned," said the stranger. "As I flatter myself he will be, if he does not look more to his own sins and less to those of his neighbors. Look yonder and see how Deacon Peabody is faring." Tom looked in the direction that the stranger pointed, and beheld one of the great trees, fair and flourishing without, but rotten at the core, and saw that it had been nearly hewn through, so that the first high wind was likely to blow it down. On the bark of the tree was scored the name of Deacon Peabody, an eminent man who had waxed wealthy by driving shrewd bargains with the natives. He now looked around and found most of the tall trees marked with the name of some great man of the colony, and all more or less scored by the axe. The one on which he had been seated, and which had evidently just been hewn down, bore the name of Crown and Shield, and he recollected a mighty rich man of that name who made a vulgar display of wealth, which it was whispered he had acquired by buccaneering. "He's just ready for burning," said the black man with a growl of triumph. "You see, I am likely to have a good stock of firewood for the winter." "But what right have you," said Tom, "to cut down the Deacon Peabody's timber?" "The right of a prior claim," said the other. "This woodland belonged to me before one of your white-faced race put a foot upon the soil." "And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold?" inquired Tom. "Oh, I go by a variety of names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others. In this neighborhood I am known by the name of the Black Woodsman. I am sure he to whom the red men consecrated the spot, and in honor of whom they now and then roasted a white man by way of sweet-smelling sacrifice. Since the red men have been exterminated by you white savages, I amuse myself by presiding at the persecutions of Quakers and Anabaptists. I am the great patron and the prompter of slave dealers, and the grand master of the Salem witches. The upshot of all which is that, if I mistake not," said Tom sturdily, "you are he commonly called Old Scratch." "The name at your service," replied the black man with a half-civil nod. Such was the opening of this interview, according to the old story, though it has almost too familiar an air to be credited. One could think that to meet with such a singular personage in this wild, lonely place would have shaken many man's nerves, but Tom was a hard-minded fellow, not easily daunted, and he had lived so long with a turgent wife that he did not even fear the devil himself. It is said, after this commencement, they had a long and earnest conversation together as Tom returned homeward. The black man told him of great sums of money buried by Kidd the pirate under the oak trees on the high ridge not far from the morass. All these were under his command and protected by his power, so that none could find them but such as propitiated his favor. These he offered to the place within Tom Walker's reach, having conceived an especial kindness for him. But they were not to be had only on certain conditions. What these conditions were may be easily surmised, though Tom never disclosed them publicly. They must have been very hard, for he required time to think of them, and he was not a man to stick at trifles when money was in view. When they had reached the edge of the swamp, the stranger paused. "What proof have I that all you have been telling me is true?" asked Tom. "There's my signature," said the black man, pressing his finger on Tom's forehead. So saying, he turned off among the thickets of the swamp, and seemed, as Tom said, to go down, down, down into the earth, until nothing but his head and shoulders could be seen, and so on until he totally disappeared. Then Tom reached home. He found the black print of the finger burnt, as it were, into his forehead, which nothing could obliterate. The first news his wife had to tell him was the sudden death of Absalom Corninshield, the rich buccaneer. It was announced in the papers with the usual flourish that a great man had fallen in Israel. Tom recollected the tree which the black friend had just hewn down, and which was ready for burning. "Let the freebooter roast," said Tom. "Who cares?" He now felt convinced that all he had heard and seen was no illusion. He was not prone to let his wife into his confidence, but as this was an uneasy secret, he willingly shared it with her. All her avarice was awakened at the mention of the hidden gold, and she urged her husband to comply with the black man's terms and secure what could make them wealthy for life. However, Tom might have felt disposed to sell himself to the devil. He was determined not to do so to oblige his wife. So he flatly refused, out of the mere spirit of contradiction. Many and bitter were the quarrels they had on the subject, but the more she talked, the more resolute was Tom not to be damned just to please her. At length, she determined to drive the bargain on her own account, and if she succeeded to keep all the gain of herself, being of the same fearless temper as her husband, she set off for the old Indian fort toward the close of summer's day. She was many hours absent. When she came back, she was reserved and sullen in her replies. She spoke something of a black man whom she had met about twilight hewing at the root of a tall tree. He was sulky, however, and would not come to terms. She was to again with the propriety offering, but what it was she forbore to say. The next evening, she set off again for the swamp, with her apron heavily laden. Tom waited and waited for her, but in vain. Midnight came, but she did not make her appearance. Morning, noon, night returned, but still she did not come. Tom now grew uneasy for her safety, especially as he found she had carried off in her apron the silver teapot. And spoons, and every portable article of value. Another night elapsed, and another morning came, but no wife. In a word, she was never heard of more. What was her real fate, nobody knows. In consequence of so many pretending to know, it is one of those facts which have become confounded by a variety of historians. Some asserted that she lost her way among the tangled mazes of the swamp and sank into some pit or slough. Others, more charitable, hinted that she had eloped with the household booty and made off to some other province, while others surmised that the tempter had decoyed her into a dismal quagmire, on the top of which her hat was found lying. In confirmation of this, it was said a great black man with an axe on his shoulder was seen late that evening coming out of the swamp, carrying a bundle of tied in a check apron, with an air of surely triumph. The most current and probable story, however, observes that Tom Walker grew so anxious about the fate of his wife and his property that he set out at length to seek them both at the Indian fort. During a long summer's afternoon, he searched about the gloomy place, but no wife was to be seen. He called her name repeatedly, but she was nowhere to be heard. The bittern alone responded to his voice as he flew screaming by, or the bullfrog croaked dolefully from the neighboring pool. At length, it is said, just in the brown hour of twilight, when the owls began to hoot and the bats to flit about, his attention was attracted by the clamor of the carrion crows hovering about the cypress tree. He looked up and beheld a bundle tied in a check apron and hanging in the branches of the tree, with a great vulture perched hard by, as if keeping watch upon it. He leaped with joy, for he recognized his wife's apron and supposed it to contain the household valuables. "Let us get a hold of the property," said he, consolingly to himself. and we will endeavor to do without that woman." As he scrambled up the tree, the vulture spread its wide wings and sailed off, screaming into the deep shadows of the forest. Tom seized the checkered apron, but, woeful sight, found nothing but a heart and a liver tied up in it. Such, according to this most authentic old story, was all that was to be found of poor Tom's wife. She had probably attempted to deal with the black man as she had been accustomed to deal with her husband, but though a female scold is generally considered a match for the devil, yet in the instance she appears to have had the worst of it. She must have died game. However, for it is said Tom noticed many prints of cloven feet deeply stamped about the tree, and found handfuls of hair that looked as if they had been plucked from the coarse black shock of the woodsman. Tom knew his wife's prowess by experience. He shrugged his shoulders as he looked at the signs of the fierce clapper clawing. "Egad," said he to himself, "Old Scratch must have had a tough time of it." Tom consoled himself for the loss of his property with the loss of his wife, or he was a man of fortitude. He even felt something like gratitude toward the black woodsman, who he considered had done him a kindness. He sought, therefore, to cultivate a further acquaintance with him, but for some time, without success, the old blacklegs played shy, for whatever people may think, he is not always to be had for calling for. He knows how to play his cards when pretty sure of his game. At length, it is said, when delay had whetted Tom's eagerness to the quick and prepared him to agree to anything rather than not gain the promised treasure, he met the black man one evening in his usual woodsman's dress, with an axe on his shoulder. Sauntering along the swamp and humming a little tune, he affected to receive Tom's advances with great indifference, made brief replies, and went on humming his tune. By degrees, however, Tom brought him to his business, and they began to haggle about the terms on which the former was to have the pirate's treasure. There was one condition which need not be mentioned, being generally understood in all cases where the devil grants favors, but there were others about which, though of less importance, he was inflexibly obstinate. He insisted that the money found through his means should be employed in his service. He proposed, therefore, that Tom should employ it in the black traffic. That is to say, that he should fit out a slave ship. This, however, Tom resolutely refused. He was bad enough in all conscience, but the devil himself could not tempt him to turn slave trader. Finding Tom so squeamish on this point, he did not insist upon it, but proposed instead that he should turn a usurer, the devil being extremely anxious for the increase of usurers, looking upon them as his peculiar people. To this no objections were made, for it was just to Tom's taste. "You shall open a broker's shop in Boston next month," said the black man. "I'll do it tomorrow if you wish," said Tom Walker. "You shall lend money at 2% a month." "Egad, I'll charge 4," replied Walker. "You shall extort bonds, foreclose mortgages, drive the merchants to bankruptcy." "I'll drive them to the devil," cried Tom Walker. "You are the usurer for my money," said Blacklegs with delight. "When will you want the rhino?" "This very night." "Done," said the devil. "Done," said Tom Walker. So they shook hands and struck a bargain. A few days' time saw Tom Walker seated behind his desk in the counting houses in Boston. His reputation for a ready-moneyed man who would lend money out for a good consideration soon spread abroad. Everybody remembers the time of Governor Belcher, when money was particularly scarce. It was a time of paper credit. The country had been deluged with government bills. The famous land bank had been established. There had been a rage for speculating. The people had run mad with schemes for new settlements, for buildings, cities in the wilderness. Land jobbers went about with maps of grants and townships, and Eldorados, lying nobody knew where, but which everybody was ready to purchase. In a word, the great speculating fever, which breaks out every now and then in the country, had raged to an alarming degree, and everybody was dreaming of making sudden fortunes from nothing. As usual, the fever had subsided, the dream had gone off, and the imaginary fortunes with it. The patients were left in doleful plight, and the whole country resounded with the consequent cry of hard times. At this propitious time of public distress did Tom Walker set up as usurer in Boston. His door was soon thronged by customers, the needy and adventurous, the gambling speculator, the dreaming land jobber, the thriftless tradesman, the merchant with cracked credit. In short, everyone driven to raise money by desperate means and desperate sacrifices hurried to Tom Walker. Thus Tom was the universal friend of the needy, and acted like a friend in need. That is to say, he always exacted good pay and good security. In proportion to the distress of the applicant was the hardness of his terms. He accumulated bonds and mortgages, gradually squeezed his customers closer and closer, and sent them at length dry as sponge from his door. In this way, he made money hand over hand, became a rich and mighty man, and exalted his cocked hat upon change. He built himself, as usual, a vast house out of ostentation, but left the greater part of it unfinished and unfurnished, out of parsimony. He even set up a carriage in the fullness of his vainglory, though he nearly starved the horses which drew it. And as the ungreased wheels groaned and screeched on the axle-trees, you would have thought you heard the souls of the poor debtors he was squeezing. As Tom waxed old, however, he grew thoughtful. Having secured the good things of this world, he began to feel anxious about those of the next. He thought with regret on the bargain he had made with the Black Friend, and set his wit to work to cheat him out of the conditions. He became, therefore, all of a sudden a violent churchgoer. He prayed loudly and strenuously, as if heaven were to be taken by force of lungs. Indeed, one might always tell when he had sinned most during the week by the clamor of his Sunday devotions. The quiet Christians who had been modestly and steadfastly traveling Zionward were struck with self-reproach at seeing themselves so suddenly outstripped in their career by this new-made convert. Tom was as rigid in religious as in money matters. He was a stern supervisor and censor of the neighbors, and seemed to think every sin entered upon their account became a credit on his own side of the page. He even talked the expediency of reviving the persecution of the Quakers and the Anabaptists. In a word, Tom's zeal became as notorious as his riches. Still, in spite of all the strenuous attention to forms, Tom had lurking dread that the devil, after all, would have his due. That he might not be taken unawares, therefore it is said, he always carried a small Bible in his coat pocket. He had also a great folio Bible on his counting-house desk, and would frequently be found reading it when people called on his business. On such occasions, he would lay his green spectacles in the book to mark the place, while he turned round to drive some usurious bargain. Some people say that Tom grew a little crack-brained in his old days, and that, fancying his end approaching, he and his horse, new shod, saddled and bridled, and buried with his feet uppermost, because he supposed that the last day of the world would be turned upside down, in which the case he should find his horse standing ready for mounting, and he was determined, at the worst, to give his old friend a run for it. This, however, is probably a mere old wives' tale fable. If he really did take such precaution, it was totally superfluous. At least so says the authentic old legend, which closes his story in the following manner. One hot summer afternoon in the dog days, just as a terrible black thunder gust was coming up, Tom sat in his counting house in his white linen cap and India silk morning gown. He was on the point of foreclosing a mortgage by which he would complete the ruin of an unlucky land speculator for whom he had professed the greatest friendship. The poor land jobber begged him to grant a few months' indulgence. Tom had grown testy and irritated and refused another day. "My family will be ruined and brought upon the parish," said the land jobber. "Charity begins at home," replied Tom. "I must take care of myself in these hard times." "You have made so much money out of me," said the speculator. Tom lost his patience and his piety. "The devil take me," said he, "if I have made a farthing." Just then there were 3 loud knocks at the street door. He stepped out to see who was there. A black man was holding a black horse, which neighed and stamped with impatience. "Tom, you are come for," said the black fellow gruffly. Tom shrank back, but too late. He had left his little Bible at the bottom of his coat pocket, and his big Bible on his desk, buried under the mortgage he was about to foreclose. Never was a sinner taken more unawares. The black man whisked him like a child into the saddle, gave the horse a lash, and away he galloped, with Tom on his back, in the midst of the thunderstorms. The clerks stuck their pens behind their ears, and stared after him from the windows. Away went Tom Walker, dashing down the street, his white cap bobbing up and down, his morning gown fluttering in the wind, and his steed striking fire out of the pavement at every bound. When the clerks turned to look for the black man, he had disappeared. Tom Walker never returned to foreclose the mortgage. A countryman who lived on the border of the swamp reported that in the height of the thunder gust he had heard a great clattering of hoofs and howling along the road, and, running to the window, caught the sight of a figure such as I have described, on a horse that galloped like mad across the fields, over the hills, and down into the black hemlock swamp toward the old Indian fort, and that shortly after a thunderbolt falling in that direction seemed to set the whole forest ablaze. The good people of Boston shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders, but had been so much accustomed to witches and goblins and tricks of the devil in all kinds of shapes from the first settlement of the colony, that they were not so much horror-struck as might have been expected. Trustees were appointed to take charge of Tom's effects. There was nothing, however, to administer upon. On searching his coffers, all his bonds and mortgages were found reduced to cinders. In place of gold and silver, his iron chest was filled with chips and shavings. 2 skeletons lay in his stable instead of his half-starved horse, and the very next day his great house took fire and was burnt to the ground. Such was the end of Tom Walker and his ill-gotten wealth. Let all griping money brokers lay this story to heart. The truth of it is not to be doubted. The very hole under the oak tree, whence he dug Kidd's money, is to be seen to this day, as the neighboring swamp and old Indian fort are often haunted in stormy nights by a figure on horseback, in morning gown and white cap, which is doubtless the troubled spirit of the usurer. In fact, the story was resolved itself into the proverb and is the origin of the popular saying, so prevalent throughout New England, "The Devil and Tom Walker." Now, I will say that was a very good story, but I also want to add this is Old Scratch of all of the fellows. So far, we've spoken of Osmodius in a previous story, the devil on two sticks. Though not directly spoken of, my friend the devil. Of course, as I said, Old Scratch. And then we have my dear friend right over here, Belial. Aren't they lovely? Well, let's move on. The Devil in Manuscript by Nathaniel Hawthorne. On a bitter evening of December, I arrived by mail in a large town which was then the residence of an intimate friend, one of those gifted youths who cultivate poetry and the belles letters and call themselves students of law. My first business, after supper, was to visit him at the office of his distinguished instructor. As I have said, it was the bitter night, clear starlight, but cold as Nova Sembla, the shop windows along the street being frosted as almost to hide the lights, while the wheels of the coaches thundered equally loud over frozen earth and pavements of stone. There was no snow, either on the ground or on the roofs of houses. The wind blew so violently that I had but to spread my cloak like a mainsail and scud along the street, and the rate of 10 knots, greatly envied by other navigators who were beating slowly up, with the gale right in their teeth. One of these I capsized, but was gone on the wings of the wind before he could even vociferate an oath. After this picture of an inclement night, behold us seated by a great blazing fire, which looked so comfortable and delicious that I felt inclined to lie down, and, rolling among the hot coals, the usual furniture of the lawyer's office was around us. Rows of volumes in sheepskin and a multitude of writs, summons, and other legal papers scattered over the desks and tables. But there were certain objects which seemed too intimate, that we had little dread of the intrusion of clients, or of the learned counselor himself, who indeed was attending court at a distant town. A tall decanter-shaped bottle stood on the table between two tumblers, and beside a pile of blotted manuscripts, altogether dissimilar to any law documents recognized in other courts. My friend, whom I shall call Oberon — it was a name of fancy and friendship between him and me — my friend Oberon looked at these papers with peculiar expression of disquietude. "I do believe," said he soberly, "or at least I could believe, if it shows that there is a devil in this pile of blotted papers. You have read them and know what I mean. That conception in which I endeavored to embody the character of fiend as represented in our traditions and the written records of witchcraft. Oh, I have a horror of what was created in my own brain, and shudder at the manuscripts in which I gave the dark idea a sort of material existence. Would they were out of my sight, and mine too, thought I. You remember," continued Oberon, "how the hellish thing used to suck away the happiness of those who, by simple concession that seemed almost innocent, subjected themselves to his power. Just by my peace." Where is this one going? This one is a little dry. Let's skip forward to The Devil and Daniel Webster. I think I like this one. Stephen Vincent Benet. It is a story they tell in the broader country, where Massachusetts joins Vermont and New Hampshire. Yes, Daniel Webster's dead, or at least they buried him, But every time there is a thunderstorm around Marshfield, they say how you can hear his rolling voice in the hollows of the sky. And they say that if you go to his grave and speak loud and clear, Daniel Webster, Daniel Webster, the ground will begin to shiver and the trees begin to shake. And after a while, you hear a deep voice saying, "Neighbor, how stands the Union?" Then you better answer the Union stands as she stood, rock-bottomed and copper-sheathed, once and indivisible, or he's liable to rear right out of the ground. At least, that's what I was told when I was a youngster. You see, for a while, he was the biggest man in the country. He never got to be president, but he was the biggest man. There were thousands that trusted in him right next to God Almighty, and they told stories about him and all the things that belonged to him that were like the stories of the patriarchs and such. They said when he stood up to speak, stars and stripes came right out in the sky. And once he spoke against a river and made it sink into the ground. They said when he walked the woods with the fishing rod, kill all, the trout would jump out of the streams right into his pockets. For they knew it was no use putting up a fight against him. And when he argued a case, he could turn on the harps of blessed and the shaking of the earth underground. That was the kind of man he was. And his big farm up at Marshfield was suitable to him. The chickens he raised were all white meat down through the drumsticks. The cows were tended like children, and the big ram he called Goliath had horns with a curl like a morning glory vine and could butt through an iron door. But Daniel wasn't one of your gentleman farmers. He knew all the ways of the land, and he'd up by candlelight to see that the chores got done. A man with a mouth like a mastiff, a brow like a mountain, and eyes like burning anthracite. That was Daniel Webster. In his prime, and the biggest case he argued never got written down in the books, for he argued it against the devil. Nip and tuck and no holds barred, and this is the way I used to hear it told. There was a man named Jabez Stone, lived at Cross Corners, New Hampshire. He wasn't a bad man to start with, but he was so unlucky a man. If he planted corn, he got boars. If he planted potatoes, he got blight. He had good enough land, but it didn't prosper him. He had a decent wife and children, but the more children he had, the less there was to feed them. If stones cropped up in his neighbor's field, boulders boiled up in his. If he had a horse with spavins, he'd trade it for one with staggers and give something extra. There's something folks bound to be like that, apparently. But one day, Jabez Stone got sick of the whole business. He'd been plowing that morning, and he had just broke the plowshare on a rock that he could have sworn hadn't been there yesterday. And as he stood looking at the plowshare, the off horse began to cough, the ropey kind of cough that means sickness in the horse doctors. There were 2 children down with the measles. His wife was ailing, and he had a whitlow on his thumb. It was about the last straw for Jabez Stone. I vow, he said, and he looked around him of desperate. I vow it's enough to make a man want to sell his soul to the devil. And I would too, for 2 cents. Then he felt a kind of queerness come over him at having said what he had said, though naturally being a New Hampshire man. He wouldn't take it back, but all the same, when it got to be evening, and as far as he could see, no notice had been taken, he felt relieved in his mind, for he was a religious man. But notice is always taken sooner or later, just like the good book says. And sure enough, next day, about supper time, a soft-spoken, dark-dressed stranger drove up in a handsome buggy and asked for Jabez Stone. Well, Jabez told his family it was a lawyer come to see him about a legacy, but he knew who it was. He didn't like the looks of the stranger, nor the way he smiled with his teeth. They were white teeth and plentiful. Some say they were filed to a point, but I wouldn't vouch for that. And he didn't like it when the dog took one look at the stranger and ran away howling, with his tail between his legs. But having passed his word, more or less, he stuck to it, and they went out behind the barn and made their bargain. Jabez Stone had to prick his finger to sign, and the stranger lent him a silver pen. The wound healed clean, but it left a little white scar. After that, all of a sudden, things began to pick up and prosper for Jabez Stone. His cows got fat, and his horses sleek. His crops were the envy of the neighborhood, and lightning might strike all over the valley, but it wouldn't strike his barn. Pretty soon, he was one of the prosperous people of the county. They asked him to stand for selectman, and he stood for it. There began to talk of running him to the state senate. All in all, you might say the Stone family was happy and contented as cats in a dairy. And so they were expected for Jabez Stone. He'd been contented enough the first few years. It's a great thing when bad luck turns. It drives most other things out of your head. True, every now and then, especially in rainy weather, the little white scar on his finger would give him a twinge. And once a year, punctual as clockwork, the stranger with the handsome buggy would come driving by. By the 6th year, the stranger lighted, and after that, his peace was over for Jabez Stone. The stranger came up through the lower field, switching his boots with the cane. They were handsome black boots, but Jabez Stone never liked the look of them, particularly the toes, which, after he had passed the time of day, said, "Well, Mr. Stone, you're a hummer. It's a very pretty property you've got here, Mr. Stone." "Well, some might favor it, and others might not," said Jabez Stone, for he was a New Hampshireman. "Oh, no need to decry your industry," said the stranger, very easy, showing his teeth in a smile. "After all, we know what's been done, and it's been according to contract and specifications. So when the mortgage falls due next year, you shouldn't have any regrets. Speaking of that mortgage, mister," said Jabez Stone, and he looked around for help of the earth and the sky, "I'm beginning to have one or two doubts about it." "Doubts?" said the stranger, not quite so pleasantly. "Why, yes," said Jabez Stone. "This being the USA, and me always having been a religious man," he cleared his throat and got bolder. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm beginning to have considerable doubts as to that mortgage holding in court." "There's courts and courts," said the stranger, clicking his teeth. "Still, we might as well have look at the original document," and he hauled out a big black pocketbook full of papers. "Sherwin, Slater, Stevens, yes, Stone," he muttered. "I, Jabez Stone, for a term of 7 years. Oh, it's quite in order, I think." But Jabez Stone wasn't listening. He saw something else flutter out of the black pocketbook. It was something that looked like a moth, but it wasn't a moth. And as Jabez Stone stared at it, it seemed to speak to him in small sort of piping voice, terrible small and thin, but terrible human. "Neighbor Stone," it squeaked. "Neighbor Stone, help me, for God's sake, help me." But before Jabez Stone could stir a hand or foot, the stranger whipped out a big bandana handkerchief, caught the creature in it, just like a butterfly, and started tying up the ends of the bandana. "Sorry for the sorry. Sorry for the interruption," he said. As I was saying, but Jabez Stone was shaking all over like a scared horse. "That's Mr. Stevens' voice," he said in a croak, "and you've got him in your handkerchief." The stranger looked a little embarrassed. "Yes, I really should have transferred him to the collecting box," he said with a simper, "but there were some rather unusual specimens there, and I didn't want them crowded. Well, these little contrapments will occur. Contramps will occur." "I don't know what you mean by contraritan," said Jabez Stone, "but that was Mr. Stevens' voice, and he ain't dead. You can't tell me he is. He was just as spry and mean as a woodchuck Tuesday." "In the midst of life," said the stranger, kind of pious. "Listen." Then a bell began to toll in the valley, and Jabez Stone listened, with the sweat running down his face, for he knew it was tolled from Mr. Stevens, and that he was dead. "Those long-standing accounts," said the stranger with a sigh. "One really hates to close them, but business is business." He still, and the bandana in his hand, and Jabez Stone felt sick as he saw the cloth struggle and flutter. "Are they all as small as that?" he asked hoarsely. "Small?" said the stranger. "Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Why, they vary." He measured Jabez Stone with his eyes, and his teeth showed. "Don't worry, Mr. Stone," he said. "You'll go with very good grade. I wouldn't trust you outside the collecting box. Now, a man like Daniel Webster, of course, well, he'd have to build a special box for him. And even at that, I imagine the wing spread would astonish you. He'd certainly be a prize. I wish he would see our way clear to him, but in your case, I was just saying." "Put that handkerchief away," said Jabez Stone, and he began to beg and pray. But the best he could get at the end was 3 years' extension with conditions. But till you make a bargain like that, you've got no idea of how the fast 4 years can run. By the last months of those years, Jabez Stone's known all over the state, and there's talk of running him for governor. And it's dust and ashes in his mouth, for every day when he gets up, he thinks there's one more night gone, and every night when he lies down, he thinks the black pocketbook and the soul of Mr. Stevens, and it makes him sick at heart, till finally he can't bear it any longer, and in the last days of the last year, he hitches up his horse and drives off to seek Daniel Webster. For Daniel was born in New Hampshire, only a few miles from Cross Corners, and it's well known that he has a particular soft spot for our old neighbors. It was early in the morning when he got to Marshfield, but Daniel was up already, talking Latin to the farm hands and wrestling with the ram Goliath and trying out new trotter for the speeches. Working out a trotter for working up speeches to make against John C. Calhoun. But when he heard a New Hampshireman had come to see him, he dropped everything else he was doing, for that was Daniel's way. He gave Jabez Stone a breakfast that 5 men couldn't eat, went into the living history of every man and woman in Cross Corners, and finally asked him for how he could serve him. Jabez Stone allowed that it was a kind of mortgage case. "Well, I haven't pleaded a mortgage case in a long time, and I don't generally plead now, except before the Supreme Court," said Daniel. "But if I can, I'll help you." "Then I've got a hope for the first time in 10 years, said Jabez Stone, and he told him the details. Daniel walked up and down as he listened, hands behind his back, now and then asking a question, now and then plunging his eyes at the floor as they bore through it like gimlets. When Jabez Stone had finished, Daniel puffed out his cheeks and blew, and he turned to Jabez Stone, and a smile broke over his face, like the sunrise over the Monadnock. "You've certainly given yourself the devil's own row to hoe, neighbor Stone," said he, "but I'll take your case." "Yes," said Daniel Webster, "I've got about 75 other things to do and the Missouri Compromise to straighten out, but I'll take your case. For if 2 New Hampshiremen aren't a match for the devil, we might as well give the country back to the Indians." Then he shook Jabez Stone by the hand and said, "Did you come down here in a hurry?" "Well, I admit I made time," said Jabez Stone. "You'll go back faster," said Daniel Webster, and he told him to hitch up the Constitution and Constellation to his carriage. They were matched grays with one white forefoot, and they stepped like greased lightning. Well, I won't describe how excited and pleased the whole Stone family was to have the great Daniel Webster for a guest. When they finally got there, Jabez Stone had lost his hat on the way, blown off when they overtook a wind, but he didn't take much account of that. But after supper, he sent the family off to bed, for he had most particular business with Mr. Webster. Mrs. Stone wanted them to sit in the front parlor, but Daniel Webster knew front parlors and said he preferred the kitchen. So it was there they sat, waiting for the stranger, with a jug on the table between them and a bright fire on the hearth. The stranger being scheduled to show up on the stroke of midnight, according to the specification. Well, most men wouldn't have asked for better company than Daniel Webster and a jug, but with his every tick of the clock, Jabez Stone got sadder and sadder. I think I had too many strikes there. Well, most men wouldn't have asked for better company than Daniel Webster and a jug, but with every tick-tock of the clock, Jabez Stone got sadder and sadder. His eyes roved round, and though he sampled the jug, you could see he couldn't taste it. Finally, on the stroke of 11:30, he reached over and grabbed Daniel Webster by the arm. Mr. Webster," he said, and his voice was shaking with fear and desperate courage. "For God's sake, Mr. Webster, harness your horses and get away from this place while you can." "You've brought me a long way, neighbor, to tell me you don't like my company," said Daniel Webster, quite peaceable, pulling at the jug. "Miserable wretch, what I am," groaned Jabez Stone. "I've brought you a devilish way, and now I see my folly. Let him take me to the Wills. I don't hanker after it, I must say, but I can stand it. But you're the Union stay and New Hampshire's pride. He mustn't get you, Mr. Webster. He mustn't get you." Daniel Webster looked at the distracted man, all gray and shaking in the firelight, and laid a hand on his shoulder. "I'm obliged to you, neighbor Stone," he said gently. "It's kindly thought of you. But there's a jug on the table and a case in hand, and I never left a jug or a case half finished in my life." And just at that moment, there was a sharp rap at the door. "Ah," said Daniel Webster very coolly, "I thought your clock was a trifle slow." Neighbor Stone, he stepped to the door and opened it. "Come in," he said. The stranger came in. Very dark and tall, he looked in the firelight. He was carrying a box under his arm, a black japanned box with little air holes in the lid. At the sight of the box, Jabez Stone gave a low cry and shrank into the corner of the room. "Mr. Webster, I presume," said the stranger, very polite, but with his eyes glowing like a fox's deep in the woods. "Attorney of record for Jabez Stone," said Daniel Webster, but his eyes were glowing too. "Might I ask your name?" "I've gone by a good many," said the stranger carelessly. "Perhaps scratch will do for the evening. I'm often called that in these regions." Then he sat down at the table and poured himself a drink from the jug. The liquor was cold in the jug, but it came out steaming into the glass. "And now," said the stranger, smiling and showing his teeth, "I shall call upon you, as a law-abiding citizen, to assist me in taking possession of my property." Well, with that argument began, and it went hot and heavy. At first, Jabez Stone had a flicker of hope, but when he saw Daniel Webster being forced back at point after point, he just sat scrunched in his corner and his eyes on that japanned box. For there wasn't any doubt as to the deal of the signature, or that was the worst of it. Daniel Webster twisted and turned and thumped his foot on the table, but he couldn't get away from that. He offered to compromise the case. The stranger wouldn't hear of it. He pointed out the property had increased in value, and state senators ought to be worth more than strangers stuck to the letter of the law. He was a great lawyer, Daniel Webster, but we know who's the king of lawyers, as the good book tells us. And it seemed as if, for the time, Daniel Webster had met his match. Finally, the stranger yawned. "Oh, your spirited efforts on behalf of your client do you credit, Mr. Webster," he said. "But if you have no more arguments to adduce, I'm rather pressed for time," and Jabez Stone shuddered. Daniel Webster's brow looked dark as a thundercloud. "Pressed or not, you shall not have this man," he thundered. "Mr. Stone is an American citizen, and no American citizen may be forced into the service of a foreign prince. We fought England for that in 12, and we'll fight hell again." Oh, I'm sorry. Why did it say 12? Anyway, I guess it is. "We'll fight at hell again." "Foreign," said the stranger. "And who calls me foreigner?" "Well, I never yet heard of you're claiming American citizenship," said Daniel Webster with surprise. "And who with better right?" said the stranger, with one of his terrible smiles. "When the first wrong was done to the first Indian, I was there. When the first slaver put out for the Congo, I stood on their deck. Am I not in your books and stories and beliefs from the first settlements? Am I not spoken of still in every church in New England? 'Tis true the North claims me as a Southerner, and the South for a Northerner, but I am neither. I am merely an honest American like yourself, and of the best descent. For to tell the truth, Mr. Webster, though I don't like to boast of it, my name is older than this country, than yours." "Ah," said Daniel Webster, with a vein standing out in his forehead, "then I stand on the Constitution. I demand a trial for my client." "The case is hardly one for an ordinary court," said the stranger, his eyes flickering, "and indeed the lateness of the hour." "Let it be any court you choose, so it is an American judge and an American jury," said Daniel Webster in his pride. "Let it be quick, or the dead. I'll abide the issue." "You've said it," said the stranger, and pointed his finger at the door. And with that, and with all of a sudden, there was a rushing of wind outside and a noise of footsteps. They came clear and distinct through the night, and yet they were not like the footsteps of living men. "In God's name, who comes by so late?" cried Jabez Stone in ague of fear. "The jury, Mr. Webster demands," said the stranger, sipping at his boiling glass. "You must pardon the rough appearance of one or two. They will have come a long way." And with the fire burned blue and the door blew open, and 12 men entered one by one. If Jabez Stone had been sick with terror before, he was blind with terror now. For there was a Walker Butler, the loyalist, who spread fire and horror through the Mohawk Valley in the times of the Revolution, and there was Simon Girthy, the renegade who saw white men burned at the stake and whooped with the natives to see them burn. His eyes were green like catamounts, and the stains of his hunting shirt did not come from the blood of deer. King Philip was there, wild and proud as he had been in life, with the great gash in his head that gave him his death wound, the cruel Governor Dale who broke men on the wheel. There was Morton of Merry Mount, who so vexed the Plymouth colony with his flushed, loose, handsome face that it had hate of the godly. There was Teach, the bloody pirate, with his black beard curling on his breast. The Reverend John Smeet, with his strangler's hands and his Geneva gown, walked as daintily as he had to the gallows. The red print of rope was still around his neck, but he carried the perfumed handkerchief in one hand. One and all, they came into the room with the fires of hell still upon them, and the stranger named their names and their deeds as they came, till the tale of 12 was told. Yet the stranger had told the truth. They had all played a part in America. "Are you satisfied with the jury, Mr. Weaver?" "Mr. Webster," said the stranger mockingly. When they had taken their place, the sweat stood upon Daniel Webster's brow, for his voice was clear. "Quite satisfied," he said, "though I miss General Arnold from the company." "Benedict Arnold is previously engaged upon other business," said the stranger with a glower. "Ah, you asked for justice, I believe." He pointed his finger once more at a tall man, soberly clad in Puritan garb, with the burning gaze of the fanatic, stalked into the room and took his judge's place. "Justice Hawthorne is a jurist of experience," said the stranger. "He presided at certain witch trials once held in Salem. There were others who repented to the business later, but not he." "Repent of such notable wonders and undertakings?" said the stern old justice. "Nay, hang them all." And he muttered to himself in a way that struck ice into the soul of Jabez Stone. The trial began, and as you might expect it, didn't look any ways good for the defense, and Jabez Stone didn't make much of a witness in his own behalf. He took one look at Simon Girty and screeched, and they had to put him back in his corner in a kind of swoon. It didn't halt the trial, though. The trial went on as trials do. Daniel Webster had faced some hard juries and hanging judges in his time, but this was the hardest he'd ever faced, and he knew it. They sat there with a kind of glitter in their eyes, and the stranger's smooth voice went on and on. Every time he'd raise an objection, it'd be objection sustained, but whenever Daniel objected, it was objection denied. Well, you couldn't expect fair play from a fellow like this, Mr. Scratch. It got to Daniel in the end, and he began to heat like the iron in the forge. When he got up to speak, he was going to flay the stranger with every trick known to the law, and the judge and jury too. He didn't care if it was contempt of court or what would happen to him for it. He didn't care any more for what happened to Jabez Stone. He just got madder and madder, thinking of what he'd say, and yet, curiously enough, the more he thought about it, the less he was able to arrange his speech in his mind. Till finally, it was time for him to get up on his feet, and he did so, all ready to bust out with lightnings and denunciations. But before he started, he looked over the judge and jury for a moment, such being his custom, and he noticed the glitter in their eyes, and twice strong as before, they had all leaned forward like hounds just before they get the fox. They looked, and the blue mist of evil in the room thickened as he watched them. Then he saw what he'd been about to do, and he wiped his forehead as a man might who's just escaped falling into a pit in the dark. For it was him they'd come for, not only Jabez Stone. He read in the glitter of their eyes and in the way the stranger hid his mouth with one hand. And if he fought them with their own weapons, he'd fall into their power. He knew that, though he couldn't have told you how. It was his own anger and horror that burned in their eyes, and he'd have to wipe that out of the case, or the case was lost. He stood there for a moment, his black eyes burning like anthracite, and began to speak. He started off in a low voice, though you could hear every word. They say he could call on the harps of the blessed when he chose. And this was just as simple and easy as a man could talk, but he didn't start out by condemning or reviling. He was talking about the things that make a country, and a man, a man. And he began with the simple things that everybody's known and felt. The freshness of fine morning when you're young, and the taste of food when you're hungry, and the new day that's every day when you're a child. He took them up and turned them into his hands. They were good things for any man, but without freedom they sickened. And when he talked of the enslaved, the sorrows of the slavery, his voice got like a big bell. He talked of the early days of America and the men who had made those days. It wasn't spread eagle speech, but he made you see it. He admitted all the wrong that had ever been done, but he showed how, out of the wrong and the right, the suffering, the starvations, something new had come, and everybody had played a part in it, even the traitors. Then he turned to Jabez Stone and showed him as he was, an ordinary man who'd had hard luck and wanted to change it. And because he'd wanted to change it, now he was going to be punished for all eternity. And yet there was good in Jabez Stone, and he showed that good. He was hard and mean in some ways, but he was a man. There was a sadness in being a man, but it was a proud thing too. And he showed what the pride of it till you couldn't help feeling it. Yes, even in hell, a man was a man. You'd know it, and he wasn't pleading for any one person anymore, though his voice rang like an organ. He was telling the story and the failures and the endless journey of mankind. They got tricked and trapped and bamboozled, but it was a great journey, and no demon that was ever foaled could know the inwardness of it. It took a man to do it. The fire began to die on the hearth, and the wind before morning to blow. The light was getting gray in the room when Daniel Webster finished, and his words came back at the end to New Hampshire ground. And the spot of land that each man loves and clings to, he painted a picture of that. And to each one of that jury he spoke of things long forgotten, for his voice could search the heart, and that was a gift, and his strength, and to one. His voice was like the forest and its secrecy, and to another like the sea and the storms of the sea, and one heard the cry of his lost nation in it, and another saw a little harmless scene he hadn't remembered for years. But each saw something, and when Daniel Webster finished, he didn't know whether or not he'd saved Jabez Stone. But he knew he'd done some miracle, for the glitter was gone from the eyes of the judge and jury, and for the moment they were men again, and knew they were men. The defense rests, said Daniel Webster, and stood there like a mountain. His ears were still ringing with his speech, and he didn't hear anything else till he heard the Judge Hawthorne say, "The jury will retire to consider its verdict." Walter Butler rose in his place, and his face had a dark, gay pride on it. The jury was considered his verdict, he said, and looked the stranger full in the eye. We find the defendant, Jabez Stone. With that, the smile left the stranger's face, but Walter Butler did not flinch. Perhaps 'tis not strictly in accordance with evidence, he said. Perhaps it is not strictly in accordance with evidence, he said, but even the damned may salute the eloquent of Mr. Webster. With that, the long crow of rooster split the gray morning sky, and judge and jury were gone from the room like a puff of smoke, and as if they had never been there, the stranger turned to Daniel Webster smiling wryly. Major Butler was a bold man, he said. I had not thought him quite so bold. Nevertheless, my congratulations as between two gentlemen. I'll have that paper first, if you please, said Daniel Webster, and he took it and tore it into 4 pieces. It was queerly warm to the touch. And now, he said, I'll have you. And his hand came down like a bear trap on the stranger's arm, for he knew that once you have bested anybody like Mr. Scratch in fair fight, his power on you was gone, and he could see that Mr. Scratch knew it too. The stranger twisted and wriggled, but he couldn't get out of that grip. Come on, Mr. Webster, said he said, smiling palely. This sort of thing is Ouch! It's ridiculous. If you're worried about the costs of the case, naturally, I'd be glad to pay. Ouch! And so you shall, said Daniel Webster, shaking him till his teeth rattled. For you'll sit right down at that table and draw up a document promising never to bother Jabez Stone, nor his heirs, or assign any other New Hampshireman till doomsday. For any Hades we want to raise in this state, we can raise ourselves without assistance from strangers. Ooh, ouch, said the stranger. Ouch! Well, they never did run very big to the barrel, but ouch, I agree. So he sat down and drew up the document, but Daniel Webster kept his hand on his coat collar the entire time. And now may I go, said the stranger, quite humble, when Daniel, seeing the document was in proper and legal form. Go, said Daniel, giving him another shake. I'm still trying to figure out what I'll do with you, for you've settled the cost of the case, but you haven't settled with me. I think I'll take you back to Marshfield. He said, kind of reflective. I've got a ram there named Goliath that can butt through an iron door. I'd kind of like to turn you loose in his field and see what he'd do. Well, with that, the stranger began to beg and plead, and begged and pled so humble that finally Daniel, who was naturally kind-hearted, agreed to let him go. The stranger seemed terrible grateful for that, and said just to show they were friends, he'd tell Daniel's fortune before leaving. So Daniel agreed to that, though he didn't take much stock in fortune-tellers ordinarily. But naturally, the stranger was a little different. Well, he pried and he peered at the lines at Daniel's hands, and he told him one thing and said another, and was quite remarkable, but they were all in the past. Yes, all that's true, and it happened, said Daniel Webster, but what's to come in the future? The stranger grinned kind of happily and shook his head. The future's not as you think it, he said. It's dark. You have a great ambition, Mr. Webster. I have, said Daniel firmly, for everybody knew he wanted to be president. It seems almost within your grasp, said the stranger, but you will not attain it. Lesser men will be made president, and you will be passed over. And if I am, I'll still be Daniel Webster, said Daniel. Say on. You have 2 strong sons, and, said the stranger, shaking his head, you look to found a line, but each will die in war, and neither reach greatness. Live or die, they are still my sons, said Daniel Webster. Say on. You have made great speeches, said the stranger. You will make more? Ah, said Daniel Webster. But the last great speech you make will turn many of your own against you, said the stranger. They will call you Ichabod. They will call you by other names, even in New England. Some will say you have turned your coat and sold your country, and their voices will be loud against you till you die. It is an honest speech. It does not matter what men say, said Daniel Webster. Then he looked at the stranger, and their glances locked. One question, he said. I have fought for the Union all my life. Will I see the fight won against those who would tear it apart? Not while you live, said the stranger grimly. But it will be won, and after you are dead, there are thousands who will fight for your cause because of words that you spoke. Why then, you long-barreled, slab-sided, lantern-jawed, fortune-telling note-shaver, said Daniel Webster with a great roar of laughter, be off with you to your own place before I put my mark on you, for by the 13 original colonies, I'd go to the pit itself to save the Union. And with that, he drew back his foot for a kick that would have stunned a horse. It was only the tip of the toe that caught the stranger, but he went flying out the door with his collection box under his arm. And now, said Daniel Webster, seeing Jabez Stone beginning to rouse from his swoon, let's see what's left in that jug, for it's dry work talking all night. I hope there's a pie for breakfast, neighbor Stone. But they say that whenever the devil comes near Marshfield, even now, he gives it a wide berth, and he hasn't been seen in the state of New Hampshire from that day to this. I'm not talking about Massachusetts or Vermont. That's the end. That was a fun one, wasn't it? I liked that book. Next, we will be reading, actually, I have another book. I may be reading that one on Facebook because that one was a friend of mine had written it and requested that I review it for people. So I may read that one on Facebook. But the next book I read here will be The Devil's Letters to Mary MacLane. I'll just read you a little dedication. I won't continue reading, but I'll just do the dedication. To those before whose trembling lips is poised the cup of sin, to those who, with enraptured eyes, behold the fleeting of paradise that lurks within. With that, my beauties, my dearest fiends, I bid you a most pleasant night rest, and make certain to tune in for movie Witch's Movie Coven, the other way around. And if I don't see you there, I'll see you on social media, and if not, then I'll see you next week. All right, my beauties. I bid you good night.